December 7th, 1941. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored at Hashirajima in Hiroshima Bay. His staff is celebrating. He is not. By war's end, one admiral who ordered thousands of young men to their deaths would refuse himself any mercy at all. Staff Officer Yasuji Watanabe documented it directly. Yamamoto sank into visible depression as the attack reports came in. The famous quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," was written by screenwriter Larry Forrester for the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. No primary source supports it, not one. What Yamamoto actually wrote is more damning. On January 9, 1942, in a letter to Ogata Takatora, editor-in-chief of the Asahi Shimbun, the most powerful press figure in Japan, he wrote, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply for the one smitten." He wasn't confessing doubt to a subordinate. He was writing to control the national narrative, trying to suppress a euphoria he knew would accelerate Japan's destruction. Yamamoto's fear wasn't intuition, it was mathematics, and the numbers had been terrifying for years. In 1937, historian Paul Kennedy calculated that the United States controlled 41.7% of global war-making potential. Imperial Japan controlled 3.5%, a ratio of nearly 12 to 1. The more precise fact, America wasn't even trying. In 1938, U.S. steel plants produced 26.4 million tons while running at one-third capacity. The other two-thirds sat idle, throttled by the Great Depression. That same year, the Soviet Union was running its mills at maximum output to produce 16.5 million tons. The U.S. was generating more steel while asleep than its rivals could produce at full strain. In 1937, Japan was spending 28% of national income on defense. The United States, 1.5%. Japan had already superheated its entire economy just to stay competitive. America hadn't started. Japanese planners saw low American military output and diagnosed democratic weakness. They were examining a dormant engine and declaring it broken. The doctrine that codified this misreading was Kantai Kessen, decisive battle. For 35 years after 1905, when Japan annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in a single engagement, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy Officer Corps was institutionally conditioned to believe one catastrophic fleet clash would force any enemy to negotiate. The doctrine worked against Russia. Nobody within the IJN ever seriously modeled what happened if the enemy simply kept building ships. They had a doctrine for the battle they wanted. They had no plan for the war that actually began. On December 7, 1941, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircraft struck 8 U.S. battleships at Pearl Harbor. Most were pre-Washington Naval Treaty vessels, slow, shallow-drafted, and of marginal value in the carrier war already beginning. The Arizona sank. The Oklahoma capsized. 5 others were later raised and returned to service. Nagumo never struck the oil. Approximately 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in unprotected, above-ground storage tanks on Pearl Harbor's oil farms. The Red Hill Underground Fuel Storage Facility, designed to protect exactly this supply, was still under construction. Admiral Chester Nimitz stated after the war that destroying those tanks would have forced the Pacific Fleet to retreat to the U.S. West Coast, delaying any American offensive by a minimum of 2 years. Japan would have had its defensive perimeter in the Pacific. Nagumo turned for home after 2 strikes. He also missed the carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were not in port on December 7th. Their survival would define the next 6 months of the Pacific War. Yamamoto had already calculated what 6 months meant. In 1940, before the war began, he told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe directly, "I can run wild for 6 months, or perhaps a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." He was not being modest. He was being precise. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, June 4th to 7th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. The prophecy closed on schedule. In February 1942, Yamamoto had transferred his flag from Nagato to the newly commissioned Yamato. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built. He was now commanding from the most powerful warship in history. Within months, it would be strategically useless. The IJN High Command was operating under Senshobyo, victory disease. After Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, and the Indian Ocean raids, they had begun to believe their own momentum was structural. It was not. It was a streak. The IJN's intelligence was not defeated by better enemy intelligence. It was defeated by its own success. And 6 months later, at Midway Atoll, the reckoning arrived. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, had cracked the Japanese JN-25B naval cipher. Japan's primary strategic weapon, tactical surprise, was gone before the battle began. The USS Yorktown had taken severe damage at the Coral Sea. Estimated repair time, 90 days. 1,400 shipyard workers ran continuous shifts for 72 hours and returned her to combat-ready status. She sailed for Midway, with welders still working below decks. The popular image of Japanese carriers loaded and ready to strike when the American dive bombers arrived is fiction. Partial and Tully's Shattered Sword, using Japanese primary sources, demonstrates that the flight decks were empty of strike aircraft. The carriers were caught mid-cycle in a chaotic rearming sequence, flight operations suspended. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and 110 veteran pilots. The number that actually ended Japanese naval air power? Over 700 elite aircraft mechanics, armorers, and aviation technicians went down with those ships. These were men who required years to train. Japan could manufacture replacement airframes. It could not manufacture replacement institutional knowledge. The IJN never again sustained complex multi-carrier air operations. U.S. submarines sank 1,113 Japanese merchant vessels across the war, nearly 5 million tons of shipping, representing approximately 60% of all Japanese maritime losses. The Kantai Kessen doctrine had no provisions for commerce protection. Convoy escort was an institutional afterthought. The IJN had spent decades planning to destroy enemy fleets. It had no architecture for protecting its own supply lines. The consequence was structural strangulation. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, Japan's primary fuel source, collapsed to less than 10% of pre-war levels by late 1944. Battleships sat immobilized in harbor for lack of fuel. Factories halted for lack of bauxite and iron ore. The civilian population entered structured caloric deficit. The maritime sinew connecting Japan's empire to its resource base was severed, systematically, below the surface. Pre-war, the Imperial Japanese Navy trained its pilots to a minimum of 700 flight hours, a small elite cadre built over years. After Midway and the sustained attrition of the Solomons campaign, that pipeline was catastrophically accelerated. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were being deployed to combat with 40 hours of total flight time. The U.S. minimum throughout the war was 525 hours. Tactician Jimmy Thatch entered combat with 3,500 hours. Critically, veterans like Thatch were rotated home to refine training curricula, a deliberate institutional feedback loop that continuously improved the quality of new pilots. Japan was not rotating its veterans home. It was expending them. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. U.S. aviators flying F-6F Hellcats under radar directed combat air patrol annihilated over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single afternoon. Japanese naval aviation ceased to function as a cohesive offensive force. That same day, the Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armored carrier, was struck by a single torpedo from USS Albacore. An inexperienced damage control officer ordered full mechanical ventilation with all hatches open. The system aerosolized volatile aviation fuel throughout the hull. Hours later, the Taiho detonated. 1,646 men killed. One torpedo. One wrong decision by a man who had not been trained long enough. Vice Admiral Takijirō Ōnishi arrived in the Philippines in October 1944 to take command of the 1st Air Fleet. Total operational aircraft available? 41. He ran the numbers. Conventional attack hit rates for undertrained pilots against American radar-directed air superiority, approximately 2%. Suicide crash dive hit rates, approximately 34%. Mathematically, 17 times more effective. Onishi did not dress this in ceremony. He privately called the tactic Tosotsu no Gedo, a Buddhist term meaning heresy of command. He understood precisely what he was authorizing. This was not a cultural expression of sacrifice. It was a documented, cold arithmetic response to the fact that Japan could no longer produce pilots capable of fighting and surviving. By 1944, IJN admirals were no longer fighting a war. They were managing a controlled collapse. The only question left, the one this documentary asked from the beginning, is exactly when they knew. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogated surviving IJN commanders after the war. The testimony of Captain Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto's former staff officer, was unambiguous. The entire IJN officer corps recognized the war was irretrievably lost following the fall of Saipan in July 1944. Saipan breached Japan's inner defense perimeter and placed the home islands within operational range of B-29 superfortresses. They knew. Every senior officer knew. The military government structure made surrender impossible anyway, producing another year of kamikaze campaigns, firebombing, and ultimately, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 15th, 1945. Following the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Vice Admiral Takijirō Ōnishi committed seppuku. He deliberately refused a kaishakunin, a mercy executioner. He suffered for 15 hours. He had ordered thousands of young men to die, and he intended to pay the precise cost. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the largest surface fleet assembled in history at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was found after the war by an American interrogating officer quietly tending potatoes in his garden. Asked what caused Japan's defeat, he didn't discuss tactics, radar, or enemy skill. His answer? We ran out of oil. At what exact moment do you believe the Japanese High Command truly lost control of their own strategic destiny? The mathematics were visible from 1937. The order to attack was given in 1941. The moment of recognition was July 1944. But the moment of no return? Leave your answer in the comments.